You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
In this special bonus episode of Saving Elephants, I have a conversation with my good friend Justin Stapley. A crossover conversation, if you will, because this exact same conversation gets repurposed for his podcast also, The Conservative Underground. I will have links to it in the show notes, and you should definitely check it out. Justin was first on this podcast clear back in episode number 30, and has been by for many panel discussion and other single episodes since then. But it has been quite a while since I've been able to nail down his schedule long enough to sit down and do this recording. He is certainly a man who keeps busy. And this conversation centers around some of the similarities between the two of us and our similar journeys in trying to defend the classical conservative tradition. Now, I have been producing this Saving Elephants podcast now for over 7 years. And in that time, Justin has launched various podcasts, Substacks, shows, organizations. I counted them up, a total of 7, about one a year. For every year I've been podcasting, he has launched a brand new endeavor. And while each of these projects or ventures are something he pours his full heart and soul into, and does an excellent job, I think, at capturing the political moment, I do take him to task somewhat in this conversation, asking if perhaps an intervention is needed. Justin and I, personality-wise, and on some other beliefs we don't really get into in this conversation, are very different. But our similarities are far more important, especially in this political moment. And I think that comes through in this conversation. I really think the work we're doing here at Saving Elephants is a joint effort. It's something that's going to require people from all over the United States working in their various capacities. Maybe you don't have to start a podcast. Maybe you don't have to start a new organization every year. But we can all do something. We can all do something to better grasp the American founding and what it means to conserve that moment. And that is something Justin is grappling with as it shines through in this conversation. So with all that, I give you my conversation with Justin Stapley.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
So yeah, I'm here with Josh, and we both have somewhat similar stories with how we got involved into more of a intellectual, philosophical way of thinking about politics. Let's start with you, Josh. Like, when did you first hear about Burke?
I will answer that question, but that's a very nice way of saying we both have similar stories as to how we seeded into the meaningless background of our political moments, right? We were both more heavily involved within our respective political parties and have been trying unsuccessfully, it would seem, to if you'll pardon the pun, to save the Republican Party. When did I first hear about Burke? I think it's like, I forget what the term is for that, but that term where you hear a word you think for the first time, and then for the next solid week you hear it 1,000 times. I probably had heard about Burke many, many years ago. But it was just sort of this, oh yeah, that guy's important. He said some good things. I think the only thing I ever knew he said, which is what most people know, is that all it takes for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. That's the hashtag we often attribute to Burke. I've seen it attributed wrongly to Abraham Lincoln occasionally, although he may have said it for all I know.
Yeah, it's one of those phrases, right? Hanging out there in the ether. Who knows? Actually, will ultimately get claimed for it in the end.
I know there's probably a lot of complete losers and dunders who've said the same thing, but it gets attributed to Burke, who did actually say it or wrote it down anyways. But I became aware, I'll say, of Burke's importance at around 2016, when probably you and I had a similar sort of, hey, what's going on here? What is conservatism? How do I dig into this? How do I understand? If I'm trying to tell people that this isn't conservatism, well, I don't want to be a hypocrite. Do I actually know what this means? And Burke was the name that just kept coming up over and over. And in particular, I read The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk, which is not probably the best place to start if you don't have a launching off point, but it's a wonderful book. I would highly recommend. It's just a little daunting. It's very thick. I
Yeah.
had heard that Russell Kirk was essentially an advocate for Burkean conservatism.
Hmm.
Didn't really know what that meant, but read it enough to say, okay, I can kind of see where he's coming from. This guy seems to be important. He's not. Kirk himself says, look, I'm not saying that Burke is the heir conservative, if you will, the central figure. It's more of a where are we at in this present moment, by which Kirk meant the 1950s, but you can stretch that up until today.
Hmm.
Uh, in this world of the past, say, 200 plus years of sort of a revolutionary spirit, warring spirits between the French or English ideas, if you will, of what revolution and liberty look like. Burke, he believed, and I happen to believe also, was the central figure that most eloquently and passionately stated the conservative position in this essential argument we've been having in the Western world for centuries.
Hmm.
And so that's why he kind of weds it there. It's not that there weren't, you can say Aristotle was a conservative or Hooker was a conservative, but they lived in different periods that don't comport to ours as well.
Yeah.
So after that, I read his most famous book, Burke's most famous book, that is Reflections of the Revolution in France. Again, not a good jumping off point. Will not claim I understand it at all the first time I read through it, but it was eloquent. It was beautiful. I enjoyed it. And it was really reading Yuval Levin's The Great Debate, which depicted the arguments between Burke and Thomas Paine and their
Yeah.
sort of English versus French understandings, again, of revolution. That kind of pulled all these things together for me, and it was sort of a light bulb moment. I was like, oh, I get it. I see how Burke not only had important things to say for the British people, but how he has a wider understanding of a philosophy of change, say, that we American conservatives can actually use and grasp quite nicely into our constitutional system, and actually works quite well as a mechanism against the socialists, the progressives, and even I would even go so far as to say the purely classical liberals as kind of a conservative bulwark. That is probably way more words than what you were looking for, but that's sort of how I got introduced to
No.
Edmund Burke.
No, it sounds like, yeah, it was very close to the same time period where I kind of had my, um, I guess you could say, epiphany as well, started seeing things changing in 2015 and 2016. I'll never forget, the first time someone even talked about Trump running. I think it was either late 2015 or early 2016, but me and my father have a very, very good close friend of ours who I grew up next to, and mowed his lawn and everything, and he was all, very much a Democrat, and it never bothered us because, hey man, we get all believe what we want to believe, and whatever. And he kind of like smirked, was like, so you guys gonna support old Donald Trump? And both me and my dad kind of laughed. We're like, yeah, probably not. you know um I mean, both me and him have a strong military background, and we were turned off from him very early on because of his the whole uh uh I hesitate to say straight up dodge drafting, but it is pretty dang close to dodge drafting that Trump was engaged in, and his whole like, oh, I'm so much smarter than the generals, and we're just kind of like, nah, not for us, and I think I think at that point in time, almost everybody was expecting that he was essentially just running to try to, like, get a new season of Apprentice going, or something like that. And no one really thought it was a serious effort. And then all of a sudden he managed to tap into something that
Mhm.
I think we're still trying to understand fully. And he just took off. And I think a lot of people chose to then either dig in some way or form, like either like dig in absolutely anti-Trump or dig in this or dig in that way. And I think you and I kind of had an interesting, similar, unique response where we kind of took a step back and we're like, what is going on?
Yeah.
What does this mean? What is conservatism? I mean, I know for myself, so I started listening to Sean Hannity in high school. By the time that Trump showed up in 2015, I'd probably listened to Sean Hannity for over a decade. I started
Mhm.
listening to Glenn Beck after I got back from my LDS mission. That probably would have been like 2008, 2009. My first books on politics, my first conservative books were like Glenn Beck's Common Sense and things like that, and of course, heavy dosage of Fox News and, you know, um,
Yeah, I still have back here behind me somewhere Rush Limbaugh's "See, I Told You So." It was kind
there
of
you go. There you
Limbaugh was
go.
sort of my political awakening.
Mm-hmm. That's funny. I didn't start listening to Limbaugh until like college for some reason. For most people, he's the first, and then they go on from there. But for some reason, I kind of discovered him a little bit later. I don't know if that's just a product of the Utah talk radio market or what that was about. Um, but yeah, I'm like, what the heck? Like, I had a background in American history. I studied American history at Southern Utah University for 2 years before I went and uh, did law enforcement instead of continuing college at that point in time. Uh, and I guess maybe that was where I had a foundation of something different is going on because I had
Mhm.
that kind of basis in founding ideals. And I'm like, this seems different. It seems like an aberration, but I couldn't. I was kind of like you. How am I supposed to say this is wrong if I don't understand what is right? How do I quantify what at that point is just a gut? Um, Now, I think I probably started at what is a more typical jumping off point, meaning that my first book was Conscience of a Conservative by Goldwater, which is
That's
a
a much
very,
better one to
yeah,
start with.
very short, very accessible. But I also think that probably set me off on the different course since that is a little bit more on the liberty side of things and the
Right.
tradition side of things. And that led me more towards um, Frank Meyer, that led me more towards Hayek and more towards Locke. And so, I mean, obviously, I think the differences between Burke and Locke are sometimes highlighted more than the fact that they were both Whigs,
Hmm.
you know. Um, but yeah, I definitely ended up more on the liberty side of the fusionist coin of things. Um, but yeah, it just really opened up that door, and then eventually, you created this awesome long going podcast, which has been would been really cool. I dove more into the academic world. I actually went back to school. I now have a bachelor's degree in constitutional studies and political philosophy. I'm wrapping up my master's right now, and really kind of opened up my kind of you know gaze to understanding even the ways that conservatism started this aberration all the way back in the early 90s. Um, I really feel like the 92 presidential election is one of the big trigger points that broke the Republican Party and broke the conservative movement. We may have even talked about this before, but have you kind of observed that yourself to a certain extent?
It's hard to say when, if and I'm sure you read Matthew Continetti's The Right, a 100-year history essentially of the right. He made a point in there that I think was helpful, which is that MAGAism, for lack of a better term, it hadn't had that, has had variants for the past 100 years.
Hmm.
And there have been ways in which they've been in some sort of an alliance with traditional conservatives or antagonistic to traditional conservatives or vice versa. And so I think the problem there is it makes it almost impossible to say, aha, 1992 is we sowed the seeds for this thing going wrong. I really think we
Yeah.
sowed the seeds when Adam and Eve ate the apple, although
Yeah.
what an apple, whatever the fruit was, right? I think this is endemic of human nature, but I think it is obviously it is helpful to an extent to be able to go back in history and say, wait a minute, did things change here? And in 92, of
Yeah.
course, what we can say is that, we the conservative movement had come to fruition, if you will, in the 80s. We had won. We've defeated the Soviet Union. We've elected Ronald Reagan. To a certain extent, I can forgive a person for seeing George H.W. Bush as a continuation, and I don't think he was a terrible president. Certainly by comparison today,
Hmm.
I long for the days of George H.W. Bush, but almost okay, maybe we could oscillate between a Reagan type classical conservative versus a more, I don't want to say Nixonian, that's not quite right, but a sort of
Maybe
more.
more a Rockefeller type Republican to
Yeah,
a
and even
certain
that doesn't
extent.
seem fair because Rockefeller
Yeah.
was pretty left of center in a way that I don't
Yeah.
think Bush ever was. But both individuals were respectable, honorable, decent individuals who had had a long history of either articulating or living out American values and virtues. And then along comes Bill Clinton, and
Hmm.
I think you would be correct to say that sort of shattered whatever delusion the right was in that we've won. Seemed to get it back in '94, right? A couple of years later with this massive Republican wave. And
Hmm.
I honestly think that kind of shattered things too, because here we get this massive Republican wave, and yet what really changed?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying some things didn't, don't get me wrong. But
Well, and you can also point to a lot of the ways that a lot of the broken pieces of Congress do unfortunately derive from the way that Gingrich led the institution.
Yes, and I think there's a great deal, and hopefully we can be forgiven for our age at the time. You know, we were pretty dang young when Clinton and Gingrich were battling
Hmm.
it out. Gingrich to me was good, Clinton was bad. It was as simple as that. It wasn't until many years later I began to recognize, oh, some of these, as you correctly said, some of these problems stem from the Gingrich revolution. Some of the problems we deal with today, some of the brokenness of Congress, if you will.
Hmm.
No, maybe there's a midpoint there. Maybe some of the things he did was good and right for the time, but it was a little too much. I don't know. But quite frankly, I think Newt Gingrich was the Bill Clinton of the right. He was about as morally depraved as Clinton, and I just was unaware of this at the time.
Yeah, yeah,
But I do want to ask you though, and somewhat in way of trying to answer your question,
yeah.
because there are a couple of moments I remember for myself after 2016 when both you and I were saying, "What is going on here?" That I kind of thought back over the many years I had been involved at various levels within conservative and or Republican events, groups, organizations. And I started to question myself, okay, did I misread certain situations? The what I would call more odious version of populist voices. Not, I'm okay with a populist sort of, there's something about the salt of the earth people that maybe they don't have a real sophisticated view, but they're
Hmm.
very they have a good heart and I think good instincts. I'm talking about the more burn it all down type populism
Hmm.
we
Hmm.
see. I started to wonder maybe that was there more than I'd ever appreciated. And there were a couple of moments I remember I was in Washington, D.C. once for I believe it was the American for Prosperity event. And they just had speaker after speaker that was essentially just sort of red meat, rah, 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 get the crowd going.
Hmm.
And it was okay. I was like, okay, whatever. To me, I was there to meet people. And so I was like, this is the thing I have to put up with in order for the breaks in between to actually, visit with folks. And then I remember George Will got up and spoke. And I had never heard, I didn't know who George Will, I've heard of him, but I never heard him
Hmm.
speak. I never read anything or he had written. And it was just so radically different than everyone else. I was like, whoa, like I don't know why he doesn't get the standing ovation. Why, not the whole time he's talking, but when he's done, like he is different. He's not just titillizing the conservative senses, if you will. He's actually speaking with more authority and
Hmm.
depth. And I also remember there was an instance in which my now brother-in-law and I went to an event. It was, I don't even know what you call it. It was some sort of an odd Fox News event with Glenn Beck and Bill O'Reilly,
Hmm.
back when O'Reilly was more in good graces, if you will.
Hmm.
Um, that I thought at first they were going to be there, but it was like some sort of a satellite campus where there's like 20 different theaters across the
Oh,
country. They were
geez.
live
Uh-huh.
somewhere and we got to see them. And I just remember Jason and I sitting there in the audience would just go nuts over these two, like they're rock stars. What is going on? Like, I don't feel like I'm a part of this group at all. Like they're kind of, I
Yeah.
think we're probably aligned politically in a lot of ways, but I just remember those kind of moments where it was like, whatever it is that the crowd seemed to be seeking was not necessarily the same thing I thought was interesting. And I do wonder to what degree that made it easier for myself and perhaps you in 2016 to not get carried away with things. Not that
Yeah.
we're better than those folks, but sort of like maybe from the very beginning we were looking for something different.
Well, I think that is one of the difficult things to recognize about the history of the right, especially in the last 20, 30 years, is it turned 2016 revealed that there was a lot more lip service towards Reaganism going on than I think a lot of us realized, and that as soon as people had the opportunity to dump a lot of that, they jumped on that opportunity. Um, and then also just the fact that we were speaking the same language, using the same words, but we weren't all necessarily meaning the same things.
Hmm.
Um, and I remember one of the things that really kind of opened up a new kind of world, a more philosophical, intellectual world, was the against Trump issue of National Review.
Hmm.
Um, because all of a sudden I was introduced to
I've still
a
got
lot
that
of,
magazine down here, by the way.
you got that? That's
Yeah.
awesome. That's awesome. But yeah, it introduced me to I mean, I read it because Glenn Beck was in it, right? Because
Ah,
up at that point I was a Glenn Beck listener, avid Glenn Beck. Um, but like it was the first time I was introduced to, David French, Jonah Goldberg, Eric Erickson, just a host of all of these writers who are more on that like intellectual, philosophical, real movement conservatism. Like we actually are committed to these values, as opposed to just, like you said, giving red meat to the crowd. Um, and it's what really kind of like I realized that I started learning and really embracing the founding vision at a very early age. I remember I was a kid and my grandparents they were both janitors and caretakers at Southern Utah University down in Cedar City, and every year they have a big Shakespearean festival. And they usually got free tickets to that to go to various things. And one of the productions I got to go to when I was a young kid was actually 1776, which it
I didn't know Shakespeare wrote 1776.
no, no. It's the Shakespearean Festival, but they do
Oh, fair
lots of
enough.
different
Okay.
productions. Yeah, lots of
Fair
different
enough.
productions. But yeah, it's definitely a vulgar take a little bit on the the story, but it was still, as a kid, it was like it brought a lot of these historical figures alive for me, and like, oh, interesting. Plus the nuance of it, right? You know.
Mhm.
And then I got a hold of a book series when I was a kid called Prelude to Glory. It tells the story of the revolution from kind of the Latter-day Saint viewpoint, where we believe it was an inspired event. Um, and then of course that's what I studied in college in American history. And so I had that root, that core. And so when people talked about these ideals under Reaganism, to me it was a perpetuation of that founding vision. It made sense to me. I connected it to it. That's why I became a conservative, because I believed in conserving the American founding.
Mm.
And sadly, there is a part of the American right, whether we want to call it populist, whether we want to call it nationalist, or simply right wing, that was never as fully connected to the American founding, to the idea of conserving the American founding. Um, and during the Reagan years, because Reagan was so successful and popular, Reaganism kind of proliferated. This was the party standard, right? And so a lot of that proliferated for a long time. And by 2016, it turns out that those of us who viewed conservatism as purely an effort to conserve the founding vision, we were a bit more in the minority than we had ever realized. And
Mhm.
Trump, he was able to connect to that no one else had seen. And I don't even know if he did it on purpose, because I think the guy's just sometimes a lucky son of a gun. But you know, he was able to tap into that, connect it, and then that gave the excuse for a lot of these more, red meat in your face rabble rouser types to jump to what is a more profitable brand for them. You know, the Sean Hannity's, different things. Some people came along slowly. It took Mark Levin and Glenn Beck a couple years to fully, embrace MAGAism. And even now you're starting to see, especially Mark Levin, he has been speaking out a lot more lately, which has been encouraging to see.
I did not know
Um,
that. Happy to hear it.
Unfortunately, I think he's still the popular thing these days right now is to phrase it as in the people around Trump are
Mhm.
doing the wrong things, and
Mhm.
they're giving Trump the wrong information. So we just need to let people know that they're steering him the wrong way, and we want to steer him the right way. And I don't know. I think the success of that effort is limited, but everyone's going to try to do things the way they're going to do. But yeah, it's really been interesting, and a part of this kicks into, I don't know if you had a chance to listen to my episode from last week about the origins of the left and right, but
I have not.
yeah. So just to kind of break it down, basically, I essentially started with the French Revolution, explained how the idea of left and right was based in the 1789 French Assembly, with the left being the people that were for the revolution and the right being people that were for the ancient regime. And that has led to a lot of complications in understanding the nuances of politics, right? Because even Burke himself, who wrote contemporaneously to that point in time, does not fit into that dichotomy, right?
Right.
Because yes, we consider him the founding father, quote unquote, of modern conservatism, and yet he exists almost in a centrist role between those two French realities, right? Because he was a Whig. He supported the constitutional monarchy of Great Britain, which was very, very free and liberal compared to the French monarchy, which was an absolutist monarchy, right? But he
It's
doesn't go.
often even fair to say within that framework, he was a strong reformer,
Mhm.
often pushing against the excesses of even the British monarchy.
Exactly. It's just that he didn't go so far as to advocate for absolute revolution.
Yeah.
And he was a very temperate mind in recognizing that good things are built over time.
Hmm.
And, I mean, his whole idea is about prescription and stuff like that. And so you almost have like, especially in America, you could say there's like three, four, five different strains of what we might call right-wing politics that sometimes surprisingly don't have as much in common as we might think. You
Hmm.
know, I mean, like a lot of the what we might call the more intense forms of populism honestly derive from the Appalachia area of the southern United States among the Highland Scots who were not terribly really embraced with the founding vision at the time because the war didn't touch that part of the country a whole lot. To the extent it did, they were actually mostly loyalists because a lot of the Scots that settled the Appalachians were actually descendants of the Jacobites that fought an attempted revolution to bring the king back in
Hmm.
just 30 or 40 years before that with the Jacobite, mid 18th century revolutions. Um, and so and that kind of led to like the rise of Andrew Jackson, all that kind of stuff. And it's it's really complicated to try to boil down and realize that because we have a two-party system, we've all throughout history had coalitions that are very tenuous, very, very tenuous. And when you have shifting political realities like we've had in the last 15 or so years, those coalitions fall apart. And all of a sudden, the ideology, the philosophy that feels ascendant, modern conservatism, Reaganism, all of a sudden feels very much on the out and out.
Yeah, I'm wondering here, and since I had not had a chance to listen to the episode,
Mhm,
you may have very adequately covered this point here, but um, one of the one of the debates we seem to have over and over these days is how much purchase does left versus right actually have? Like, should we?
mhm,
There are some who say let's just stop talking about it altogether, and others who
mhm,
say nope, everything needs to be understood through that framework. And I could get on either side of that debate depending kind of on context. Like I think that if we reduce things as Thomas Sowell did in A Conflict of Vision, of saying essentially I'm talking about those with a constrained or unconstrained vision,
mhm,
things that I think I want to say he later probably more appropriately referred to as the tragic or the utopian worldviews.
mhm.
Um, these are things that I think we could broadly say fit within left or right. It's a big camp, right? So
Right.
in the constrained vision, we would have your Thomas Hobbes. We would also have your Donald Trumps, if you will. We would have those who have a more, say, tragic view of the world, black versus white, if you will, but also a more they're not looking to create utopias. They're looking to build on some sort of an understanding of the past, maybe complete make-believe, but nonetheless some sort of understanding. Whereas conversely, in your unconstrained view, or what we might call the utopian, you see so much of the left. Your Bernie Sanders, everything from your Bill Clinton slash Barack Obamas of, um, essentially kind of a watered down understanding of liberal democracy somehow is the last great hope and end of mankind, to
Mhm,
a more Bernie Sanders-esque demand for equality. But in both cases, it's sort of a we can do this. Give us this, give us the strength, the authority, the power, and we will make a better world. And I think there is a degree in which that is, in fact, useful.
mhm,
But you can also say, well, yeah, but MAGA also believes give us the power, we'll make a better world. And,
mhm,
sometimes, and something that I find kind of frustrating is I've yet to meet any human that is fully constrained or unconstrained. I've yet to meet anyone that truly believes, 110% humans cannot change or they're completely malleable. I think we're actually talking about a difference of emphasis here, although you can cross some sort of boundary to where you say, okay, clearly that's of the left or of the right. And so I think I don't know if the left does this, but man, the conservatives, like traditional conservatives, we spent a long time trying to define things, trying to understand, okay, well, this is exactly what that term means. Not, and I will say oftentimes I've noticed the more populist elements we've been talking about, they'll spend a long time trying to define things, but not to illuminate, but rather to shackle them with some sort of yeah, and the left will do this too. Well, you're a racist or a bigot, or the right, well, you're a
Yeah.
socialist, you're a communist. Everything gets reduced to some sort of a byword that we no longer have to engage in an argument in any fair debate. And it's super complicated.
Yeah.
I guess for myself, I'm somewhere straddling the line of left versus right is very important in certain circumstances, and other times it just completely muddies the debate in a way that's not helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned in my podcast, so I actually studied under Professor Verlin Lewis, who wrote The Myth of Right and Left. Um, and I think he
Is
makes
he one of the Lewis brothers?
yes.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Yeah, I've
Yep.
heard him on podcasts, but they
Yeah.
make a pretty persuasive case. They've
Yeah.
almost convinced me.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Very persuasive. I do, however, kind of like I think I land on where Jonah Goldberg lands on, and I kind of mentioned this in my podcast last week that I do think that there's a certain utility to having basic terms at hand that the general public understands. Um, and I did break down in that podcast how like so the French origin is pretty simple, revolution versus tradition, and that was kind of the original, and that has a certain utility. And then also in the 20th century, we got into kind of, a communism versus democracy type, left and right to a certain extent.
Mhm.
But the the problem that I've noticed in the last, especially 10 or so years, is our attention spans have gotten so limited, so narrow. We make a lot of terms cover more than they should. There's a lot of terms out there: nationalism, populism, left wing, right wing. We've expanded them to cover such a broad category, and it's complicated by the fact that we assume that there's so much consensus on certain terms. I mean, look at democracy, for example. Uh, we've kind of gotten to a point in academics, for example, that we don't feel the need to specify that when we say democracy, that we're talking about a liberal democracy or a republic. To the extent a lot of people, academics, they see this whole "we're a republic, not a democracy" debate as silly, as funny, as like, why are we even having this discussion anymore? No, there is no such thing as a, pure democracy in terms of what Athens had anymore. So the idea of are we a republic or democracy seems silly to people. But then because I kind of exist in this strange position where I've got, part of my foot into academics, I got a part of my foot into activism, I've got part of my foot into, commentary. I kind of recognize that, well, wait a minute, maybe we're making a mistake in assuming that because we have an academic consensus that the general populace understands this, because
Mhm.
for however much we're assuming that, oh, when we say democracy, people know we're saying liberal democracy, which people know means republic. Turns out that when you have senators out there today who are saying that when a Supreme Court justice issues a ruling against the president that they're violating the voice of the people, maybe we don't understand what a republic is. And maybe if we don't understand what a republic is, maybe that when we're saying democracy, we're giving people this wrong idea in this country that yeah, you vote for your president, and that means the president gets to do what he wants to do. And it's like, well, to me, I feel like both sides of the political equation have gotten to a point now where they think democracy, true, pure, democratia, Greek democracy is this like pure thing, like the people have spoken,
Mhm.
where like part of the basic premise of America is that there are certain things that should be outside of the basic majority's ability to do. I think it's Kevin D. Williamson, who says along the lines, the Bill of Rights is saying what you morons can't vote on.
Right.
you know, and so I'm just giving this an example of the way that the words, we try to make them mean too much. I mean, like I think it's Jonah Goldberg who talks about how there needs to be a difference between nationalism and nationism because we create this situation where people say, well, nationalism can be good. But then all of a sudden it gives space for bad nationalism to exist. So maybe we need to better differentiate this term so that it's not so easy for these bad ideas to exist. I think that's what left and right is like. I think it's something at hand that helps people understand basically like, I can go to a Republican Party event and make the case that, hey, populism wants to do this, and that's a left-wing thing. So maybe we should reconsider what we're doing. And people have the light bulb that goes on because it's an easy, simple thing to understand. However, if we rely on that too much, then we fail to recognize that there are lots and lots of different versions of right wing and left wing, and not all of them always jive together. I mean, it's just like we were talking about. Burke is the best example. To say that Burke is right wing and to say that the monarchists in French in 1789 are right wing can make you think that they're both in the same philosophy, ideology, what have you, when in
Right.
reality, not at all. Not at all.
Right.
I would say that uh who was it? Lafayette. Lafayette was probably the most Burkean individual in the French Revolution, and both sides hated him because
Or came to. They loved him at first,
yeah,
and they came to hate him.
yeah. Well, because he was trying to say let's just establish a constitutional monarchy like Britain. And of course, the ancient regime is like, we're not going to give up power, and the revolutionaries are like, no, we're not going to maintain having a king. And so he kind of just got drummed out of being able to do a whole lot.
I mean, as you and I can well attest, being fusionistic, I'll use that, just inventing that term, sort of
Hmm.
being what I often consider to be a balance between, if I'm among my libertarian friends, I tend to be more traditionalist. If I'm with my traditionalist friends, I tend to be more libertarian.
Hmm.
Um, I would like to think I'm a pretty easygoing guy, but that does not win you a lot of friends, influence people, if you will.
Right.
And let me, I would be remiss, Justin, since our time is limited. I did want to turn to, if you don't mind me interjecting,
No, of course.
because, and look, I'm loath to have a conversation with anybody under false pretenses, but I also am your friend and do feel like an intervention is needful at some point.
Uh-oh.
In terms of your rapid production of blogs and podcasts and newsletters. And you did out yourself the other day. As you mentioned, we began this sort of journey collectively, didn't know each other, but
Hmm.
in 2016 when you wrote, and I'll just briefly go through the list here, never tyranny, your
Hmm.
stance against, look, never Trump, never Hillary, never tyranny. Okay, makes sense. But then after the 2016 election, okay, where do we go from there? So far we're on, I think, a stable path. Then you pivot to the Millennial Federalist in 2016.
Hmm.
But a couple of years later, here comes the Liberty Hawk.
Hmm.
And then after that, you have not one, but two iterations of self-evident,
Hmm.
both the newsletter and the, I'll say, short-lived podcast. Very well done, but short-lived podcast.
Hmm.
Then you really double down with the Freeman Foundation, rather. And I'm very grateful I was on the masthead. I don't know that I ever produced an original article for you on that, although I wanted to. Just got busy and sidetracked.
Hmm.
And that's a 501c3, people. That was a valiant effort, pulled together a lot of incredible voices. But for good, understandable reasons, that came to a close. You've now since opened the Conservative Underground, where I think we're
Uh-huh.
currently speaking.
Yep.
Um, Dude, what's wrong? What is going on here?
You know, it's interesting. I think a lot of it has been, I'd say a lot of it's political growth, political maturation, um, and also kind of like maybe a bit of throwing things against the wall. I mean, I think a part of the issue is that I kept trying to be relevant to the moment because I was so focused on the moment, and then that
Mhm.
moment passed. So like that very first one, right? It like a lot of people were like trying to get in this like never Trump thing and different stuff. And I wanted to try to, that was my first anonymous blog, and I wanted to try to make the point that I wasn't going to just vote for Hillary against Trump because that didn't seem like a good idea. And so this whole like never Trump, never Hillary, never tyranny thing, seemed like interesting, thing at the moment. But then once again, once that moment passed, I was like, oh, I've now defined myself by a moment that's in the past.
Right.
Um, and then I thought post Trump's victory that it was a unique moment for possibly this opportunity to get people who are more left leaning into federalism, realizing that, hey, you got this guy that you really don't like in charge of the federal government, but you still have power at the state level, And I was involved with the Federalist Coalition. I was involved with the Federalist Party. I mean, there was kind of this Federalist moment, 2017, 2018. But the party fell apart. Federalist Coalition ran out of funding. I mean, the moment kind of passed, right? And then in 2018 to 2019, it felt like, hey, there's this opportunity to create a coalition between libertarians and conservatives, and to possibly get a candidate who could actually compete at the national level, nominated by the Libertarian Party. And
This was
so,
sort of the Justin Amash as a
exactly,
potential.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so in 2019, that's kind of like the Liberty Hawk was this effort to kind of create this, like, and that was my first attempt at more of a conversational, like I wasn't just me blogging, it was me hosting almost anybody who could come in and post anything. And then we'd have like, various things. And that effort actually came close to working because Amash did kind of have a moment there in early 2020, but it kind of got shot down uh, by various individuals. They got shot down by the hardcore Libertarian Party who wanted to, just maintain their purity in the wilderness. And then also a lot of the Never Trump types, especially the Bulwark, who felt like, oh, he's just going to take votes away from Biden, you know and kind of in a fit of piqué, I kind of like got really ticked off at that point. And that's when I kind of retreated to self-evident, and that was the beginning of self-evident, was because I was like, you know what? Um, I was kind of sick and tired of trying to be involved in the actual direct political activism of it. And I'm like, I'm just going to back up and talk about first principles. I'm just going to talk about the founding and talk about things and whatnot. And that was also around the time that I went back to school. 2020 is when I went back to college. And so I kind of had that period where I was more focused on the philosophy, being on the background and whatnot. And so that's kind of where like I eventually landed. And that was my most, I would say, tumultuous period. Now,
Mm.
once I graduated from college, I had this idea for this nonprofit, and I spent a lot of the time while I was deployed in Syria, 2022 to 2023, working online, getting all the paperwork and legal work done, and we had a good go at the Freeman Foundation, but just securing funding in this climate for that kind of an effort proved to be just it wasn't going to happen at that
Yeah.
time. I mean, a lot of the organizations that are willing to fund nonprofits kind of expect you to be around, say, 3 to 4 years, and to have like a minimal paid staff before they'll consider, like, kind of really putting money towards you. And since we didn't have any seed money, it was hard for us to really kind of build that beginning foundation. And then also, just to be perfectly honest, I mean, a lot of people right now, conservative, like traditional type conservative donors, are holding their cash close to their chests right now because they don't know who to trust. I mean,
Hmm.
there are so many outfits out there that in this era have either gone over and been just diehard MAGA in order to remain relevant, or have gone the complete other direction and are boosting and working with Democrat parties and Democratic figures in order to what they feel like more effectively oppose Trumpism and MAGA. And this both those directions kind of violate, like, if you have a traditional Reaganite person who wants to give money to an institution, and they see those directions going, they're going to be like, well, I don't want to give my money to either of those efforts because that's not me. And so, once again, you kind of got to be around a while to really develop that trust and faith. I mean, look at what happened to the Heritage Foundation. I
Yeah.
mean, that was such a dramatic change. I mean, 10 years ago, this is one of the most Reaganite outfits in existence. I mean, the Heritage Foundation, like that very term, used to be almost synonymous with the Reagan administration. And to see the dramatic shift in that organization, it's insane, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I'm posing this idea somewhat tongue in cheek,
Of course.
but it does occur to me that it might hint at some difference between the two of us, Justin, which is,
Hmm.
as you had mentioned kind of at the beginning of the conversation, I've Saving Elephants as my podcast. I don't blog as much as I used to, but my blog, YouTube channel, podcast, Substack, basically everything but TikTok up till this point. Maybe maybe I'll join the dark side at some point.
Yeah.
Um, I wonder, I've done it for 7 years,
Hmm.
and I wonder if maybe as many similarities as there are between the two of us, and we know there are some differences. We haven't brought up the Hamilton versus Jefferson debate yet.
Oh boy, here we
or,
go.
or the Protestant versus LDS. Yeah, we can get into that some
Yeah.
other time. Um, but I wonder if what Saving Elephants has been more about is less political activism, less trying to seize the moment, and more genuinely saying, let's step back decades. Let's step back. Let's literally try to get back to the roots of these things.
Hmm.
Because I'll be frank, I have no idea how we get out of this mess. I
Yeah.
have some ideas how we might, but you mentioned, or rather, I brought up Justin Amash a moment ago. I can see an alternative history where maybe he could have joined the fray. Maybe he could have damaged, say, Trump enough that it would have split the right and maybe course corrected. But I didn't know. He didn't get in, he didn't jump in.
Hmm.
And even if he had, I don't know for a fact it would have worked. It may have, it may not. I don't know if Evan Mullins might have done better, maybe. Nikki Haley might have done, any one of these
Hmm.
individuals might have. And I'm just talking about
Oh
presidential
yeah.
figures. I don't truly know what it's going to take to course correct. But I do have a little bit more confidence in, okay, these ideas I believe in, and how can I faithfully articulate them? And part of this is just my skill sets. I've never been an activist. I've never known how to be an activist.
Hmm.
I've been a part of activist movements and groups, and I've always felt kind of silly because I didn't know if I was actually accomplishing much. Um, and I'm not trying to shackle you, say, with the label activism, but I'm
Hmm.
curious if perhaps that could be a difference between us. And as similar as we are, maybe we have slightly different aims, in that I'm hoping someday it'll be so blazing obvious. Okay, here's the moment, even if it doesn't work. And this is who I have to hitch my bandwagon to. The Reagan Caucus is a wonderful group, and
Hmm.
and I hope that they do well, and I hope they succeed. And I have no problem being affiliated with them to a certain extent. I just don't exhaust a lot of energy in that degree for the simple reason that we've had almost 10 years history of these groups come and go. No
Right.
problem with the Reagan Caucus, and they could be around for longer than you and I are. And
Hmm.
I'm fully supportive. I'm wondering if maybe that's, I don't know. Could you speak to that? Is that maybe a difference? Is
Well, yeah.
our
I mean, yeah.
products are different?
I think we've talked about that. I may have mentioned this to you before, but I've kind of confessed often that for however much my philosophies match, say, Madison and Jefferson and Adams and Washington, I mean, I definitely have to admit that my temperament is definitely um, Adams at his most hot-headedness and Hamilton sometimes. Like I tend to like just get like, come on, let's do something. Let's fix this right
Right,
now,
right.
Um, and also like, just I mean my background is both military and law enforcement, and so I tend to want to get in there and let's get this going. And um I've had to definitely learn to be more of a player of the long game over the years, and I think that's kind of where I've settled into that point where I'm trying to find that balance between being the academic, the activist, the commentator, all these different kind of things. Um, but yeah, I think that definitely like you've demonstrated more of the Kirkian Burkean, mentality, and yeah, I tend to be a bit more of that, Lockean, Hayek, let's overturn some tables,
Hey, it
thing
takes all
sometimes.
types.
Exactly. But yeah, I think I've definitely gotten more to a spot where I realize, You need to play the long game. You need to be patient. And I think that's one of the reasons why my efforts with the Reagan caucus has been really good and interesting to see so far because um, I really I think I mentioned this when I was talking to you briefly before we actually started the podcast, but there are a lot of ways that I feel like the anti-Trump versus pro-Trump kind of scuffle has actually caused more damage to our political culture than
Mm.
anything Trump himself has or may ever do in office. Um, I've kind of mentioned before how people keep asking me why I broke off from a lot of these Never Trump organizations that at the time I was jumping from effort is when I was really, really super engaged with this very intense Never Trump stuff, very much 2016 to 2020. And um, people ask me why I've kind of distanced myself from some of those political figures, some of those entities. And to me, it really comes down to the fact that they say, let's save democracy. We need to save democracy. That's the first and foremost thing we need to do. And if we have to like put off policy considerations to save democracy, so be it. And I'm like, well, the whole purpose of the democratic element of our government is to allow representation, right? We want our Congress to represent us. We want our local, state, federal government officials to represent us. But if we are setting down values and principles, if we're setting down policy preferences, if we're embracing this, existential dread that tells us we have to vote against whoever is worse,
Hmm.
instead of worrying about what people we are voting for actually want to do with government, then that means we don't have representation. That means that actual democratic element of our form of government is breaking down. And it gets to a point where whichever party has control just has to do with whichever, 100,000 of people somewhere in the country decided who was worse and then went this way. And it's leading to a moment where no matter who's in control, we're not getting government that actually represents us, and the democratic element is actually breaking down. So you're not actually saving democracy if you're totally disrupting the entire culture of a democratic nation, of encouraging people to get some self-discovery. What is it that you believe? Which party is the best place for those beliefs to exist? And then go there and get those ideas and beliefs on the table of discussion and tell candidates, tell current office holders, if you aren't doing what I feel like represents me, I'm not going to vote for you, and that's the basic element. And I feel like getting back to that position has been good and helped kind of grounded me a bit better. Um, and hopefully there's not any more extreme, intense changes with my efforts. I
Well, I
plan
certainly
on,
we
yeah,
live in an era of extreme, intense changes, and
yeah,
I certainly understand if you have there's a better word here, but I think I'm going to use the word impatience. I don't
mm,
there's a better word than that one, and impatience for just waiting around for things to change. I can certainly understand it necessitates kind of
mm,
some, again, there's probably a better word for this, radical responses.
yeah, yep,
I don't mean to call you an impatient radical, but I think you know what I'm getting at.
yes,
I want to ask you though, because when you were responding there, you made me think when you say people ask you about that, because you were far more enmeshed in Never Trump Inc., I'll call it, in the early days, where it was more difficult to distinguish the bulwark from the dispatch, let's say,
yeah, yeah,
where it's more difficult to distinguish principles first from, let's say, saving elephants. I don't mean to, I'm not hosting any conferences across the United States. I'm not trying to vaunt myself,
yeah.
but you know what I mean. Um, when people ask you that question, and maybe there's a mixture, but do you take it that they're more coming from a position of how dare you? Like what are you doing? Like I thought we're on the same page? Or are they, in other words, are they asking it more from, I thought we all agreed on these sort of principle verse slash bulwark slash, I'll call it, quite frankly, Democrat light
Hmm.
agreements on being anti-Trump? Or are they asking more from, I'll say, a sense of pure ignorance or ignorance of purity of ignorance, if you will? in which they themselves don't recognize or see the differences between these various groups. To them, Never Trump is all the same thing. Or in other words, are they asking out of a sense that you betrayed the team, or are they asking out of a sense of ignorance of they're unaware of the differences between one who, say, seeks first classical conservative principles over just being anti-Trump?
I mean, there's definitely the kind of out of ignorance questions, but unfortunately, I would say that more of it than I would like is, you know, oh, you're not willing to go far enough to stop Trump. You know, in fact, one of the accusations I get a lot is that I am actually the one who's too partisan because I am not willing to support Democrats
Mm,
to vote against Trump and Trump-like figures. And people will say I'm either thin-skinned or like I think one of the biggest things that tends to get dialed into is that I still have my largely pre-Trump view of progressivism. And the more like we've talked about our various paths of delving into political philosophy, um, uh, reading things such as Hayek, especially the Road to Serfdom, has made me even more against progressivism than I was when I was simply just a talk radio listener. Um, and in fact, in my exploration of history, my exploration of political philosophy, I can't help but recognize that honestly, there is a direct connection between the rise of Trump and the presidency of Woodrow Wilson.
mm,
I honestly, I can't help but just see that without the steady and time, little by little over time, digression away from basic constitutional principles that occurred over 100 years period, it wouldn't be possible for a figure like Donald Trump to rise. You know,
right.
I mean, I honestly feel like Andrew Jackson probably had more totalitarian impulses than Trump did, but he wasn't able to do a whole lot with his presidency because of how brand new we were with the Republican experiment, how brand new we were with the Constitution and the fact that people were so much more enamored to it, you know, states as opposed like the idea of state sovereignty was so much more of a steadfast thing at that time. And so Andrew Jackson was not able to be dictatorial except for very few like there's the Trail of Tears, there's a few other things, and outside of that, he was still pretty much a run-of-the-mill president with what he was able to actually do
Hmm.
because of how solid the foundation was still at that time. But now you have, I mean, it's like President Trump wouldn't be able to have a trade war if Congress hadn't essentially abdicated their role in establishing tariff policy over the last 50 years, you know? And unfortunately, people can get mad at me for pointing this out, but it's the progressive Democrats much more than the Republican Party who has led to this moment, who has led to the imperial presidential moment. I mean, you can point to Nixon. I think Nixon is the one unique difference there when it comes to Republican presidents. He really did lean into the imperial presidency. Um, but compare that to Eisenhower, compare that to Reagan, compare that to either Bush. It's just not the case. And so it never made sense to me to beat populism by giving a mandate to the political philosophy that has enabled populism. And I feel like the Biden administration kind of demonstrated the fact that unfortunately I'm right in that argument. Um, Back in 2020 there was this big celebration like we beat Trump and this and that. I remember one time I having an interaction with oh shoot, who was it? It was one of the prominent Never Trump figures. But like I'm sitting there like saying, "Hey, sure, Trump was beaten. He's not the president anymore, but I still don't really find I can't bring myself to fully celebrate because Biden's not going to govern the way that you think he's going to govern." And I kind of called the cards at the time and saying that he's gonna govern like a progressive, and that ended up happening. And people didn't realize the nature of populism, that you can't beat it at the ballot box. In fact, sometimes populism gets weaker when it wins because then it actually has to govern. When it's
Right.
when it's out of power and doesn't have to take responsibility for anything, it actually gets more powerful. And I think you saw that happen. I mean, we went from a moment in January 2021 where Trump only had, what was it? I think 34% was his approval rating. I mean, just disastrously low,
Yeah.
right? And to have someone leave the White House with that low approval rating to then get reelected 4 years later, that is just, that's not reflected anywhere else in history. That is a monumental occurrence. And to me, it does not happen without unpopular progressive democratic governance, right?
Yeah, and I'm in agreement. I
Mhm.
also want to find a way to speak persuasively to our friends on the left, say who
Mhm.
are themselves progressives, kind of a hey, help me help you message. Maybe you don't have to abandon progressivism.
Mhm.
We can have that discussion another day. But if we're both in agreement that the Trump era is disastrous, to say the American Republic,
Yeah.
um, it drives me nuts the degree to, and not everybody on the left is this way. Some of them I think are getting it, but it drives me nuts to the degree to which they seem to have learned all the wrong lessons under Biden. It's like, well, we should have doubled down. Maybe we needed more
Yeah.
lawfare. Maybe we should have had
Yeah.
two Alvin Braggs out there doing the things we're doing. And it's and I think it does. So I think there's two things going on here. One is, yes, I do believe progressivism, capital P, does lead to these sort of excesses, the Woodrow Wilsons, if you will. I think we're going to see more Donald Trumps, and there we may end up with a left-leaning Donald Trump or a
Mhm.
right-leaning or somebody who's far more dangerous, who's far more interested in dictatorial powers and far more patient and cunning. All of this is far more possible with a more progressive, centralized authority that has stripped away these institutions we conservatives have constantly been screaming about. Hey, these things are important.
Mhm.
I also think there is a means in which we can find some, I don't want to call it an allyship, but kind of a, if you can replay the 2024 election over, say, that it was almost a litmus test, if you will, of all the things you were. Donald Trump should have been beaten. He could have been beaten. He
Mhm.
left, as you say, 34% approval rating. The fact that he gained so much approval rating wasn't that he did something so wonderful in that, 2, 3, 4 year interim. It was that the left mishandled things to such a degree. Now, part of that is because their policies don't work. Part of that is because I'm sorry, I'm going to say it, a brain dead president, and they lied to us about it.
Mhm.
Part of it is that they completely missed the fact that if you do nothing more than just say double down on we're going to prosecute the last guy in office for the crimes he committed, but if the
Yeah.
vast majority of Americans aren't in agreement with you that they are either crimes or worth prosecuting and
Mhm.
are understandably a little wary, hey, this sort of looks like you're just behaving like a banana republic and putting the opposition in jail. Um, I think they completely misread that moment. There's a
Yeah.
way to handle it in a way that, there were things that Trump did that I think he ought to have been prosecuted. Uh, the way the left went about it made it impossible to prosecute him over certain
Yeah.
crimes that I personally think he did. And so I don't know. Does that make sense to you? Like
Oh yeah.
I find myself, because we're in this weird moment where because I don't stand with Trump, and I think you've confessed with this too, oftentimes there'll be people on the left that think of us as brothers in arms and
Mhm.
then are horrified when we express some pro-Reagan position. Like, well,
Right.
I haven't changed. I'm just, we're in agreement on this issue. But I think there are opportunities for us to say, look, I don't know how else to say this. I think a healthier version of the left would produce a healthier version of the right, and vice
Yes.
versa. I
Yes.
think if we had somebody that could just behave themselves long enough, it would almost force the other side to behave.
Oh yeah. I mean, if if the Democrats had selected Joe Manchin instead of Joe Biden in 2020, um, he would have been reelected in a landslide against Trump in 2024. Um, and that's the sad thing is the way that both the political parties have behaved in the Trump era has led to um, the death almost of moderate caucuses in both parties. Um,
Yeah.
at the beginning, I mean, it's like a good example is my own congressional district here in Utah. So at one point in time, we had Mia Love, She's no longer with us, unfortunately. She's passed away, but she was the congresswoman, and she was very much a non-MAGA Republican. Um, because of this, her
By
support.
the way, was she the one that Donald Trump called out during there was somebody says Mia Love. I guess there's no love there or something like it was
It
like
wouldn't
this.
surprise me. Yeah, there's usually a moment like that with most Utah politicians at some
Okay.
point.
All right. Fair enough. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. I was
No,
just that
I
name
think
sounded
you're right.
familiar.
Yeah. But anyway, so she didn't have the rabid support from the MAGA base. And so the Democrats targeted her as the
Yeah.
person that they could beat, right? They found a more moderate Democrat to run in this district. And the thing that I see happen in a lot of states that have a party that is not terribly successful, and in Utah, that's the Democratic Party, they will pick one race to focus on. And then the rest of the races, they'll actually pick people that have no chance of winning, but are going to get the headlines for being very, very left. And
Hmm.
that brings in money nationally, and they put that money towards the one race they're trying to win. Happens in California with Republicans, happens in places like Utah with Democrats. It's just how things tend to work sometimes. But anyway, they were able to win, right? They beat Mia Love. But then 2 years later, that moderate Democrat got beaten by a more MAGA Republican. And so what ended up being the end result was we lost a more reasonable Republican, you
Hmm.
know? And you see that right now. Like um Democrats are actually putting money towards MAGA candidates because they think they're going to be easier to beat in in the general election, and then they end up winning anyway. So what they ended up doing is actually empowering the existential, threat that they're all talking about. And so the blue dog Democrats are virtually gone. You know, the what was it called? Was it the Friday caucus? There's various more moderate caucuses in the Republican Party, and that's essentially gone now. And so there's just not any, both parties have essentially forced the atrophy of more reasonable candidates from either party.
Hmm.
And once again, that's why, like, this idea of a coalition of the decent sounds great, sounds awesome, sounds interesting. But time after time, the Democratic Party has refused to operate that way, you know? And it seems, and then they refuse to moderate on their positions. I mean, the second rise of Donald Trump in a lot of ways is a revolt against wokeness, you know? And to me, that demonstrates the unseriousness of a lot of Democrats and of Democratic Party leadership with addressing the Trump problem, is that they felt the necessity to double down and go full forward with this woke revolution in the midst of all of this. And people felt like they had to turn back to Trump to vote for him to push back against this stuff, you know? And
I,
go ahead.
well, I was just I'm saying because but I agree. I think it's also needful that we express, or at least I'm not. I'm assuming you're not either. My hope is not that all of our politicians would be milquetoast moderates.
No, no.
And I don't think yours is either. It's my hope is that they would embrace a sort of Abraham Lincoln prudence, if you would. You can hold to your central passions, but you need to be mindful of how is your rhetoric and how are your actions actually leading us? Where are they taking us? If your goal was to defeat Trump in 2024, you did everything wrong. I believe you were passionate about it. You screwed up from A to Z. You did everything wrong.
Hmm.
And it doesn't mean you're less passionate to say, okay, if you believe Trump is Hitler, I don't think that's true, but maybe don't back Joe Biden, or
Yeah,
maybe have the decency to say, okay, this guy needs to step aside,
yeah.
and instead
Or
we end
or
up in
maybe make sure that when you choose Biden's replacement, you have at least some form of Democratic, lowercase d Democratic selection if your whole
yeah,
argument is that Trump is a threat to democracy.
and there's just we could go on and on and on, and it's not that either party is guiltless of this. I
Hmm.
guess part of what I'm concerned about, though, is that and we see this in the Never Trump or sides too, is it's almost a misunderstanding that if you can, and you said this earlier, if you can win at the ballot box, if you could just get rid of Trump, if we could just get rid of candidate X, things are somehow better. And I don't want to deny that, elections matter and who we
Hmm.
put in office does have an impact. But I think sometimes we as a nation are in denial of how wide the problem is. It's not this tiny pinprick of a group that's super MAGA that's causing all the problems. It's a complete dearth of leadership. It's a lack. It's a crumbling of institutions of trust in our institutions. You don't get a. Don't get me wrong. I said earlier I would prefer to turn back to the world where George H.W. Bush is president. I also recognize that that's sort of how we got here. There were some things under the ether boiling that we were not addressing. I'm not a neocon in the wrong sense of the word as being used. But at the same while, sure, I prefer that world, but I would prefer that world while I have a very cautious eye building toward a better world,
Hmm.
saying that this is obviously not working for everybody. There's a lot of Americans out there that, right or wrong, let's just assume they're all wrong. It doesn't matter. They think that the country's not working for them. And just telling them they're idiots, just take your Social Security check and shut up and be happy, does not work. Insulting people doesn't work. Just convincing half the country the other half are bigoted racists, and that explains things. It doesn't work. We have to eventually find some way to rebuild trust in institutions, which means, unfortunately, reaching people where they're at. And even if they're
Hmm.
wrong, finding a way to reach their hearts, that they feel like they're being heard, that they feel like I understand I now have a place in this broader coalition, that I see some reason to trust and to hope, even if it's going to require some sacrifice on my part. And I feel like I'm just getting on a soapbox, but I guess that's
No, no,
maybe
no.
a
Yeah.
maybe a longer way of saying what you're trying to express earlier, that I'm discouraged by the degree to which individuals seem to think there are these sort of silver bullet responses of winning the ballot box,
Hmm.
and an unwillingness to engage on what is really a broader problem of the American people losing faith in their democratic institutions.
Right. I mean, so to get to your first point, the reason why I was talking about moderates is just, it is a check on parties and it helps to lead to healthy coalitions when both parties can put forward options that are decent options in whatever location throughout the country they exist. You know, so like, yeah, I'm probably always, even now, gonna almost always vote for the Republican candidate or just not vote at all because most Democratic candidates just don't reflect my beliefs and values. However, if you go back 20 years in Utah to when we had a very strong blue dog coalition, there were candidates back then that if like the Republican Party put forward a particularly bad candidate one year, and then the Democrats put forward a candidate that was palatable in that location, I might actually vote for the Democrat that year, because there used to be conservative Democrats, there used to be progressive Republicans, and both parties have gotten to the point where they feel like that's a bad thing. Like me, I am a very conservative person. I am not moderate whatsoever. Definitely not a centrist. Like I am very, very conservative. However, I appreciate a broad coalition that has
Sure.
room for moderates because I know my brand of republicanism isn't going to win in New Jersey, right? I may not like if Chris Christie was running in Utah in the Republican primary, I would vote for his opponent because I don't feel like he's the kind of Republican I want to have representing me in Congress because I feel like he's too moderate. He's, too progressive. But he's the kind of Republican who can win in the state where he's at. Same with
Mhm.
like Hogan in Maryland. And so that's kind of the point I was getting to. Like these ideas of having coalitions of the decent that can respond to when one party or the other has a radical moment. That cannot happen if the parties don't give space for candidates that can be palatable to the other side
Mhm.
more. And that's kind of I'm talking about. Like a healthy Democratic Party would have nominated Joe Manchin in 2020, not Joe Biden. Because he is a Democrat who was able to have a long, healthy career in West Virginia, you know, and he would have been far more palatable to a lot of voters that otherwise wouldn't have voted for a Democrat. But because both parties keep putting forward candidates that are more of interest to their fringes, it ends up leading to these negative partisan, by the teeth, turnouts, where it's like you have to go out there and convince that the other side is worse to get people to vote for you, and it leads to these elections that are razor thin, and then it leads to people who claim these huge mandates without having a broad support, and it just perpetuates the problem. And so for me, that was the point I was getting at with the whole
Sure.
moderate thing. Um, but yeah, other than that, I do think that that's one of the things I think you and me, that's what kind of gravitated us towards being allies and toward liking to appear in each other's podcasts and efforts, is we both understand that, and we recognize there is a broader sense of cultural rot at the basis of all of this. Um,
Mhm.
and this is again something that ended up creating a huge wedge between me and the other traditional never Trump efforts, was this inability to recognize that um, when it comes to political decay, when it comes to dysfunction, when it comes to radicalism, um, there's no dividing line somewhere magically on the political spectrum that makes one side the problem and one side the answer currently. It's just not reality. Our civic education has been terrible for well over 70 years now in this country. People don't understand how the government works. They don't understand what the government can or can't do. This allows politicians to be demagogic, to make promises that they can't keep. And it leads to them trying to go against what the government is supposed to do in order to deliver those promises. And it's just it's hard not to recognize that this exists across the entire spectrum, across both political parties, and is just a current cultural reality
Yeah.
that we are disconnected from the covenant of our government. Something that I've really gotten into a lot, and I've talked to you about this, Josh, in some of our private conversations, is this idea of political covenants, and that the Constitution um, works best when it's more than just a legal document that tells us what we can or can't do. It's something that we're actually committed to, a promise to each other as a society that these are the values we stand for in this country. And regardless of where you land on the political scale, regardless of which party you support, there is a fundamental belief and support in these basic ideas. And we simply don't have that in the country right now. We're not connected to that anymore. And either we're going to find our way towards true renewal and restoration of that idea of a political covenant in the country, or we're going to keep going down this path no matter which party wins, no matter who is in the White House. Yuval Levin doesn't really delve into the idea as much in the book as I had hoped he would, but the name of his book, American Covenant, does lead to a lot of the answer. The Constitution is the answer.
Mhm.
Conserving the Constitution is the answer, and that's what I feel like mine and yours, our brand of conservatism, is the answer. And I feel like giving people that choice is the answer. And if all we're doing is playing this lesser of two evils game where populists and progressives get to take turns tearing at the fabric of the Constitution, I don't see that actually going towards any actual solution.
Justin, I'm not going to try to one up you by coming up with a better closing. I think you said it very well there. I have definitely appreciated through the many years your various efforts and organizations. I profited from reading the people you've highlighted, and if nothing else, we haven't mentioned this yet, but profited from you introduce. I would have figured out who Frank Meyer was and Fusionism eventually,
Of
but I think
course.
you got me there at least a year earlier. You can't read George Nash's History of the Intellectual Conservative Movement in the United States without walking away realizing that Meyer's pretty dang important.
Hmm.
But that you gave me a word for fusionism, a
Yeah.
word for what I didn't really know existed. But if you're okay with, I don't know which one of us is supposed to do the wrap up, but if you're okay with it, I think this might be a good place to call the conversation closed.
Yeah, that works for me. Yeah, In Defense of Freedom is really one of my lodestar documents, and I just love that book so much. And And that was kind of our first a little foray in having conversation. What was that, episode 30 something or something along those lines? I think when you had me on and I
It's
talked
far
about
enough
Frank
back you
Meyer and
probably can't
fusionism.
locate it. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll have to go check the records. It's
I
been a bit.
remember. I think I reread that book in a week's time before that. I think that was my first ever time being on a podcast.
Oh wow.
Was that episode, and I was just like, I gotta be on top of this, but it's been a profitable journey. I think that our similar and unique journey has been beneficial. I know I feel more enriched, more connected to the country's traditions, to political philosophy, to understanding. I mean, I now have I can connect the dots going all the way back to Aristotle now in a lot of ways, and I couldn't do that 10 years ago. And it's been great to have you as a fellow traveler on that journey, and I'm sure we'll continue being on that journey. So thanks a lot, Josh.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.